Hello, and welcome to the Conversations in Time podcasts from the ORC. In this podcast, the guys will be talking about historical what-ifs, or counterfactual history for the aficionados in the audience.
Hello, and welcome to the ORC podcast, Conversations in Time. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
So this is episode 3, and again, this is a what if podcast. Destination this time will still be the ORCU, officially retired counterfactual universe. I have to get that in because I like the acronym, but that's me.
Yeah, John likes his acronyms. You'll come to know John likes these acronyms.
Where are we going to stop today?
Well, it's not very obscure. You may have read some books about this, who knows? But what we thought we'd do today is talk about the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, from Dunkirk in 1940. What if Operation Dynamo as it was, what if it had failed?
Here we are in May 1940.
Yep.
And there's the BEF on the beach.
Do we need to explain a bit for our listeners what the BEF is without won't go into too much detail?
I think an overview of that would be
so the BEF, I think its origin goes back to 1908, but it was obviously around in the First World War, but it's specifically in the Second World War. It's an expeditionary force. What it basically means is it's troops that are identified that could be sent somewhere, but obviously the place it's going to be sent to was continental Europe, because the size of the BF was by today's standards huge. So it was approximately 390,000, 400,000 troops. 9-10 divisions, a division being a single army fighting unit, so of approximately 15,000 troops, consisting of three brigades, each brigade having 3 battalions, each brigade having its own artillery and transport. The British Army at the time was completely motorised, albeit with a variety, if not dozens and dozens of different types of vehicles, but no horses by this stage. So 400,000 British troops sent to France.
So would you go? I was reading about the British Army just before the start of the Second World War, and it was considered not particularly large, in comparison to our European, equivalents, all well equipped, all well trained. I mean, would you?
No, I mean the British view of military might, if you like, over the previous 150 years is all about the Navy. So Britain is not a continental power. Britain's a maritime power. So the million-strong army, or the million and a bit strong army of the First World War, was a complete aberration. So size, no, it doesn't compare in size to the German or the French army. The French army deemed to be the best army in the world at the time. The American army, in comparison, was absolutely tiny, but we know how that changed. Other continental countries had larger armies, but then what was an army in the 1930s? It was a soldier with a rifle in a platoon with a machine gun if he was lucky, with a bit of support of artillery. Yes, they would have some tanks, but there wouldn't be many. So the British Army wasn't well equipped. Debatable. I mean, that's another debate, shall we say? But it had decent tanks. They had as good tanks as the Germans. The French probably had the best tanks. Each battalion was well equipped with light machine guns, mortars. Communication better than the French, not as good as the Germans. Support of air forces better than most, but still not as good as the Germans. So yeah, it's a balance, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. So
I mean, to be fair, many of the battalions in the BEF were territorial units, or those outside the UK being reservists. But again, they were young men in the most part, or the officers the senior NCOs may have been served in the latter stages of the First World War. So, a sprinkling of experience. The German army, remember, despite what you might have seen in the various documentaries and pictures of newsreels, was significantly horse-drawn. All their artillery was mostly horse-drawn. The so-called Panzer divisions, yes, they were all mechanised, but there weren't many of them in comparison to the infantry divisions, so...
Well, not in 1940, anyway.
Well, even later in the war, I mean, if you look at some of the pictures of post-Normandy battles, the number of dead horses is amazing. But anyway, so ultimately...
Well, it was just an aside, it was just trying to get a handle on what wouldn't have happened.
It's all about, I think, as we've said, the French had the best tanks, the Germans had the best Air Force cooperation, the British had the best number of vehicles, but ultimately it's all about tactics. It's not what you've got, it's what you do with it, isn't it? It's
Okay, so as ever with these, we don't need to worry too much about why it failed. It could be weather. The weather could have been atrocious for a few days. The Germans could have then advanced. They could have then surrendered, and 330,000 personnel, I think it was around about that, wasn't it?
A bit more, but yeah, give or take, yeah.
Yeah, would have surrendered.
Yep.
And we would have then gone into the end of May, beginning of June, actually looking at something as a massive morale dampener. Arguably, Dunkirk was seen as a victory in Britain. Obviously, it wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat, I suppose, is one way of looking at it. And that wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have had the famous "we'll fight them on the beaches" speech. I'm not sure what Churchill would have said. That would have been an interesting thing for him to say, that we've lost the army, or certainly 300,000 men plus.
Yeah, I mean, if there are some analogies which we can look at as we go through. I mean, the French obviously surrendered, and their army, a large chunk of it, was taken away to Germany to work in German industry. Some of the officers were made prisoners of war, but bulk of the so that you could presume that
they usually made them work, didn't they?
Yeah,
the normal
the private soldiers had to work. I mean, a significant number of people or soldiers were captured, up to 50 to 60,000, not around Dunkirk, but other parts of France. So there was an analogy of what happened to them. But you're right, it's the morale factors are the interesting thing. I mean, the counterfactual to the counterfactual is that there were a couple of British divisions who were captured, most notably, again, Google it, the 51st Highland Division was captured at Saint Valery. It was out of the British area on the Maginot Line with the French. It couldn't get back to Dunkirk. They went back to Saint Valery. The Navy couldn't get them, so they, after a significant fight, they surrendered. But going back to the morale thing, a new 51st Highland Division from new volunteers was. I'll have to stop a second. Give me 10 seconds, would you?
Looks like the real world is calling.
Sorry about that. It was the guy that had the crash. He didn't take the bloody reg of the flipping guy drove into him. I didn't take his reg. Why would I take his reg?
We'll draw a veil over this bit and return when it calms down.
So, 3, 2, 1.
Right, morale-wise, I was just saying... No, start again. 3, 2, 1, morale. The 51st Highland Division, it was completely replaced within 3 months by volunteers. I mean, that was fairly unusual. I mean, obviously the rest of the army was increased by size, but I take the point. I mean, it's one thing a couple of divisions being lost and people being upset about it and then volunteering, but if the deployable army, which it essentially was, is lost, morale's going to take a long
well,
time
you
to come
say
back.
That after Dunkirk,
yeah,
there was a spirit of defiance against Germany. If that hadn't have worked, I'm not sure that level of defiance in the country would have been there. I mean, all right, yeah.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I agree.
Yeah, there would have been a major downer on Britain, surely. It's almost like
yes, because it was a question of obviously they left all the kit behind, but the soldiers came back. Our boys, inverted commas, got back, and the miracle, inverted commas, of the little ships or the little boats. So that wouldn't have happened. It would have been I mean, Churchill himself said wars aren't won by evacuations, but indeed there was an evacuation. But the interesting thing, we would have to check the dates, and I'm sure people on Twitter will tell us. But Lord Halifax and people like him who were potentially keen, not for any reason other than pragmatism, who I'm not suggesting they were fascists or whatever, but who were keen to, as Britain had always done, made a peace with the continental, well, not always done, but it's frequently done, made peace with the continental adversary when things didn't go quite well. Would they have come out of the woodwork? Again, would Churchill have been asked to consider his position as Prime Minister? If Lord Halifax and some others had gone to the King and said, I wish to form a government, what would the King have done?
I think that's a good point.
Reacted?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point in that I suspect that there would be a lot of talk about appeasement or trying to do a deal, because people would have been in shock. I mean, Churchill wouldn't have been up for it, obviously. It's debatable as to whether they would have won or whether it would have been, no, we're still going to fight on.
Well, I think he might have.
We are an island. It's not as if they can waltz in.
Well, no, but it's a question of it's a question of not so much fearing defeat; it's just sheer pragmatism, isn't it?
No, that's right. Yeah, I mean, the mood, if the mood in the country is suddenly way down, because don't forget that I don't know what the mood in the country was like after Dunkirk, but I suspect there was some level of relief, like I was saying, buoyance. And if that's not there, what is?
Well, indeed, but I mean, oddly, part of the having read it and heard it, part of the point of view was that it was quite good to get rid of these allies. Oh, here we are alone, although Britain was never alone because obviously it had its empire and Commonwealth, but we haven't got to have this awkward relationship with the French and whoever, and here it became very black and white. It's us against the Germans, us being the Commonwealth and the empire and stuff against the Germans.
Which is fair, but I still think so. One of the things that comes to mind with me is that okay, the Commonwealth is still there, but the Commonwealth was starting to fade, and that's seen as a defeat by the Commonwealth. I don't. How supportive would the Commonwealth have been?
Well,
if we suddenly said, "Well, look, we've lost all these soldiers. We need more of your men to come and do stuff." I mean, that just feels
I think the answer is very
well.
I disagree. I think the Dominion forces. I mean, bear in mind, the Empire had no choice. So India had no choice, rightly or wrongly. Yeah, it was part of the empire. You know what you're told. The Viceroy of India declared war on Germany without asking anybody. He did it himself. The Australians considered themselves to be British at that point of view. The Australian Prime Minister, even after the war, the Australian Prime Minister was describing himself as British, the mother country, all that stuff. But I mean, the practicalities, they had no standing army to speak of anyway. But the Canadians, ditto. They were very keen to help, but they had no standing army to speak of.
So even if their opinion stayed the same or even got stronger, they wouldn't have been able to provide any material.
Very little. I mean,
eventually
they did. I mean, obviously.
But exactly. But we're talking about the aftermath of the loss of the expeditionary force.
Yeah.
I mean, okay. So we can come back to that. I've got another thing that I wonder what would have happened or whether this could have happened. So, and that's to do with whether Hitler would have tried to do some sort of surprise invasion, not waiting, but trying to seize some sort of opportunity to make some sort of statement, just to see whether, the morale would collapse if there was a German, doesn't even have to be a large invasion, but landing troops. I mean, I don't know what the defences would have been like in Britain, without the army that returned from Dunkirk. I mean, certainly they wouldn't have been, they wouldn't be in Britain. So what was left? What was left in Britain?
Well, there was a significant amount of forces left. I mean, the clue is in the term expeditionary. The BEF was a deployable expeditionary force. It wasn't the army, so there was plenty of artillery, tanks left in Britain. There was plenty of soldiers. So I think ultimately the impact to Britain of losing the BEF materially was limited because there was plenty of factories still building tanks. There was plenty of factories still building guns. There was plenty of soldiers who hadn't yet been called up. The Navy is completely intact. The RAF is completely intact.
Absolutely, but when you're talking about the army, and I'm not talking about people who haven't been called up, because you have to call them up, you have to train them.
Yeah.
That takes time. If somebody was somebody was mad enough to think, okay, let's keep pushing, you won't have an army in time if it was a month later.
Well, no, but there was plenty of divisions left back in the UK. I mean, what?
Okay, which is fine. I don't actually know how many, how big the army, the British Army was left in Britain.
There was an equivalent number of divisions left in the UK. I mean, interestingly enough, after in the original history, after the BEF was withdrawn from Dunkirk, a number of divisions were sent to Brittany. So every has this idea, and it's supported in films and stuff, that the BEF is withdrawn from the beaches of Dunkirk, and that's it. Next Battle of Britain. Well, it didn't work like that. The Battle of Britain wasn't for another 6 weeks. Although some people consider the whole attack on France as the precursor to the Battle of Britain. But the divisions were sent to Brittany as to create a so-called redoubt, an area of France that Britain could defend, which was patently ridiculous. Another one of now the good news for them is they got there. the French army essentially surrendered, and they realised, well, we can't sit here in Brittany on our own, so they were withdrawn in good order without being attacked, and so there was if Britain could afford to send troops to Brittany after Dunkirk, it could certainly afford to defend itself in the UK. So I don't think materially in terms of what impact did the loss of the BF have on the army. Well, it lost a hell of a lot of tanks. I'm not saying it lost a hell of a lot of artillery, vehicles in particular. What that would have mean really was that it couldn't send anybody anywhere for several years. So you couldn't send reinforcements to the Western Desert, to Egypt. That wouldn't have happened. It couldn't have sent.
So let's talk about that then, because I mean that was because that happened so quickly after, or the start of that was June 1940.
Which sorry,
the Western African.
No, it was
campaign,
really near the end of
1940.
Near the end of 1940 against the Italians. The Germans didn't turn up the next year, so the.
So how many? So I mean, and I don't know. I mean, I am making an assumption that some of the soldiers who made it from Dunkirk were moved to North Africa.
Not really until the Germans turned up. So the Africa Corps turned up late in 1941. That's when reinforcements were sent to Egypt. So the existing forces in the back end of 1940 pushed the Italians back thousands of miles, and that's when they asked for German reinforcements. And the German reinforcements pushed what was known as Western Desert Force back to the borders of Egypt, out of Tripoli. That's when reinforcements were sent from the UK to keep the Africa Corps at bay. So it was back and forth to the Africa Corps for another year. But those forces wouldn't have been available. So we wouldn't have been any forces to send. So the Africa Corps probably, again, another counterfactual. We won't go too far down this track because we're off track. But you lose the BEF. You can still defend the UK. The RAF is there. The Royal Navy is the most powerful navy in the world. Probably not a massive problem. But you haven't got an army to send anywhere. And even if you do, as you said, if you could find soldiers, you can train them up in 3 months. It takes you weeks and weeks, if not, weeks and weeks. It takes you months and months to get all the artillery pieces, all the anti-tank guns, all the tanks back. You haven't got that to send to the Western Desert, to Egypt. Remember that Churchill in the original history, we will fight them on the beaches, blah, 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 blah. He was confident enough he was confident enough then to send tanks to Egypt, even under threat of invasion of southern England. He knew that was unlikely. So he sent tanks to Egypt. He wouldn't have had those tanks. Well, he would have had those tanks, but he'd have to keep them because that's all he had. So he wouldn't have been able to reinforce the Middle East. You can't reinforce the Middle East.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I know it's difficult to think of what would have happened, but I mean, what would the morale of the British Army in North Africa have been? Forgetting the fact that later on in the campaign, the reinforcements, there would have been less, and it's almost like, do we think that would they have been more resilient? Still push the Italians back.
It depends what this is the thing ultimately. It depends what the Germans did with the 400,000 British soldiers. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute they were treating them like Russians or Poles. I summarily executed them or worked them to death. But there is this sort of concept of holding the BEF hostage. Now, what does that mean? That's the question. I said I don't think it would be extreme treatment and stuff, but it could be. You could threaten it. You could work them not to death, but you could work them such that their life's pretty poor, and then publicise that. You could make not directly to the heads of government, but you could make appeals to the British people, inverted commas, through the medium of the day, radio. But
did they do that for any of the French forces?
Well, no, because they didn't have to do that because the French had surrendered. I mean, that's the difference, isn't it? But they did it to the French army anyway. They had the French soldiers, much like Italians and Germans were later on. French soldiers were working in German fields right up to the end of the war. As were Dutch and Belgian, and to a certain extent.
So there's a potential then for the British Army to be used in some sort of, like you say, hostage scenario, or as a bargaining chip to try and twist
bargaining chip
Churchill's arm into doing something.
I think it's whether direct contact would have been so to summarize, material impact in the UK I think would be limited. It would have had an impact to Western Desert, and we can go way down that path, but you lose the Suez Canal, blah blah blah. Whether you do or not, I don't know. But the biggest thing really is, as you've pointed out, is morale. And I think it's not so much necessarily morale to the public, our grandparents, if you like, but it's the morale, it's the implication of morale to the governing class. As we know, the Lord Halifax, for whatever reason, and they were Nazi sympathisers. They know that the army is being held hostage, inverted commas, or the BEF is being held hostage, inverted commas. They know there's a lack of material in the UK because it's all sitting on the beaches of Dunkirk. They would put pressure on the regime of Churchill. I mean, bear in mind it's a democracy, so he has to pass. If there's a no confidence vote in House of Commons, he cannot be the Prime Minister. That's the given way it works. So the question, if he fails a confidence vote, somebody else has to become Prime Minister, and who is that person? Well, Halifax.
That's an interest. Yeah, that would be an interesting.
Yeah. Well, Halifax was the original second choice, if you like. He may come back in the frame, and he's an appeaser, or he wants to maintain. And if Hitler came at him, as allegedly he was going to, with, well, you can keep your empire, most of it. We would like Malta, we would like Gibraltar. You can keep India, and by the way, we won't invade you. Whether you could trust them, of course you couldn't trust them, but they wouldn't necessarily worry about that too much. So that morale aspect, I think, is through the governing class, the political characters. I don't think there's a way in 1940 to influence morale as there is today with TV and social media and WhatsApp and all the rest of it. You can't,
Well, when Churchill became Prime Minister, was there a war cabinet then?
Yes, there was, because he was a member of it before he was Prime Minister. So yes,
right.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering whether it would, Halifax was the only choice, or whether it had been something.
Yeah, Halifax became whilst Churchill was Prime Minister, Halifax became the Foreign Minister. Now he died, I think, a year or two later of cancer, but but he was the Foreign Minister, and he spent a lot of his time in America for obvious reasons. So so there was a war cabinet. So he hadn't left. He hadn't gone into exile. He wasn't like Edward VII. He hadn't been sent abroad to keep him out of trouble. So he was still there. And
so arguably, if he's second, if he was the second choice and would, say there was Churchill had to step down.
Yeah,
I mean that's quite feasible. Like I say, it's a democracy, and people would have been potentially shouting for changes to make the problem go away, as people do. At least we know something about Halifax. It's interesting, if he'd have become Prime Minister and then died, it makes you wonder who would have been third choice. But
well, there's a number of characters. I mean, ironically, Lloyd George, who was obviously Prime Minister in the First World War, he was also an appeaser. He was keen to do, but he died mid 1940s, or certainly before the end of the Second World War, 1940 something. There was obviously Anthony Eden, who was an ally of Churchill's. He became Prime Minister in the 1950s. He was Prime Minister and waiting for 10 years, waiting for Churchill to give up. But he was a senior colleague of Churchill. He wouldn't probably have been chosen because he was not an appeaser. There was Harold Macmillan, who was, again, one of Churchill's associates, became Prime Minister 15, 20 years later. He wouldn't have been chosen. So, the number of people who could have been chosen was limited, but you only need one. Well, obviously, there's some fringe elements there, but they were in, like Sir Oswald Mosley, but he was in prison. He wasn't in Parliament. But as we've seen over the years in this country, you can quickly get people in Parliament if you really need to. You can either put them in the House of Lords at the stroke of a pen, or you can have them elected in some. So I guess he would be an extreme candidate, shall we say, or an unlikely candidate. So the question is ultimately, though, is why would Churchill lose a no confidence vote? I know it's our argument. So there's only what would he be voting against? So Churchill had only been Prime Minister. Well, Churchill was made Prime Minister the day the Germans attacked France. So 6 weeks later, the BEF, could you blame him for the loss of the BEF in 6 weeks?
Probably not.
Probably not. So he wouldn't have had a vote of confidence then. But again, with the so 1940 would have probably been all right. The RAF would have won the Battle of Britain. The Germans wouldn't have invaded. So 1940, 1941 was all about the Mediterranean. the Western Desert.
So just on another quick thing, which and it'll come into 1941, for me, is what do you think American public opinion would have been to the loss of the BEF?
Indifference, I suspect. I mean, it's easy to look back and think that the Americans were keen to help Britain. Roosevelt was, but American public opinion wasn't. It was very isolationist. It was happy to sell anything to anybody, so if you want to buy it, you can have it. And obviously Britain was the only country, once France had gone, that was in a position to go and get it. Germany couldn't go to America and pick up weapons and material. So I think indifference, you got to think.
Well, I think you're right, but I think that later on in 1941, when there was, after Pearl Harbor, I think that indifference would have been deeper. I don't think that the support for sending troops to Europe would necessarily have been as potentially strong. All right, so Roosevelt said,
because if you think of the point of our question, it's the 400,000 British soldiers have been captured. Why would the Americans care?
Well, because
a million French soldiers have been captured. I mean, why is France any different from, millions of French soldiers have been captured and France has surrendered? Well, Britain hasn't surrendered.
No, but the Allied forces were at least, arguably in partnership. When you see the Allied leaders, you see Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin. You don't see the French leader.
Correct.
And if Churchill was a loser, and he could be conceived as a loser within the US, it might be, look, this is all US led. And Britain's not even part of it.
Well,
we just take orders from the US and end up.
That comes back to propaganda to a certain extent. I mean, it's an interesting point. Churchill was a loser. Well, Churchill was a loser because Britain didn't actually win anything until the Battle of El Alamein. Yes, it won the Battle of Britain, but that was a
Battle of the Atlantic. Yeah,
well, that hadn't been won until 1943. So Britain's propaganda was that Britain can take it. Britain can withstand German bombing, which it did. Britain can fight back, which it did. We're bombing Germany, not very well, but as good as the Germans could. Britain wasn't doing any major land operations other than the Western Desert, and until 1942, really, that didn't really amount to a great deal. Beating very poorly equipped Italian forces, and then as soon as the Germans turned up, it becoming a bit harder, it becoming quite equal, to be fair. There's a lot.
I think I just think that there would have been an impact in some way. Even if it would have been, impact, we wouldn't have been full partners, sort of thing.
Well, okay. I'm not convinced. The only impact would have been, I think.
It is what if you can.
Well, no, I agree, but you have to explain why. What Americans wouldn't know how many British soldiers had been lost. Because, bear in mind that approximately 70,000 were captured anyway. So we're only talking about 5 times as many as had already been captured. 100,000 were lost at Singapore.
Well, I suppose, to be fair, we don't know how the Dunkirk was reported. I don't know how Dunkirk was reported in the US at the time. But, if it was reported, I've seen you could argue.
Yeah.
You could imagine how the loss of it would be reported. It certainly would be reported. In the US,
it was reported much as it was reported. Yeah, it was reported similar as it was here. So some of the newsrooms I've seen that it was a strategic defeat, but a successful evacuation. What they don't go into detail, and they didn't do it in Britain either, is that none of the equipment was ever, literally none of the equipment was taken back or got back. So they don't mention that. They don't mention it in Britain for obvious reasons. Because they don't want to give it away to the Germans how much stuff he may have left. But no, so it was seen as a miracle, but then still a strategic defeat. And I think ultimately the loss of France itself, the French army was deemed to be the best army in the world, but it was defeated in 6 weeks. The loss of France was the massive shock to countries out, to everybody, to Britain, to French themselves, obviously, to America, to dominions and empire. The loss of the French army, the defeat in 6 weeks of the French army, was the massive shock. Had you added on to that the British Expeditionary Force had been lost as well, people would have said, well, that's hardly surprising, is it? So the counterfactual is almost, how the hell did they get them off Dunkirk? More than the question of why didn't they? So I don't. But
you could say, France was lost, Britain was defeated, Hitler as Europe. Okay, then Dove will just leave Europe to Europe. We wash our hands of it.
Indeed. Well, that's indeed. But
that was what a lot of people in the US wanted. All I'm saying is that it could have been an even stronger desire by the population. Anyway, just a view on my side. So that's the US, and I probably went off on a tangent that way. It was just that there would have been an impact. It wouldn't have just carried on as in the real world if that had happened. I think that there would have been some negative impact to the war as it progressed in one way or another.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, right, back to North Africa.
Yeah, so you've lost all your equipment, which happened anyway. You've lost 9 divisions. What can't you do? So what was done and what could have been done? So what, as I said before, tanks were sent to Egypt during the height of the invasion scare in the original history. You wouldn't have done that because those were the only tanks you had, and more at the point, those were the only tank soldiers you had. You had no more, so you would hold on to them. So I suspect Churchill wouldn't have sent forces to the Western Desert. They wouldn't have pushed the Italians back 1,000 miles. They wouldn't therefore have had that gap when the Germans turned up. Would the Germans have got all the way to the Suez Canal and further on? Possibly. I mean, ultimately, in the original history, part of the reason that the Africa War did so well was because of the splitting of the British forces, sending some to Greece. The best of the forces, mostly the Australians and some of the best British divisions, were sent to Greece. That ended badly. Many of them were gotten off in a second series of evacuations from Greece, then Crete. There wouldn't have been forces through that, so you wouldn't have done that in the first place. So your best troops would have still been in Egypt. Probably could have kept the Germans at bay. So again, it's the sort of, because you can't do X, you don't do Y, and it ends up in the same result. So I think ultimately Britain wouldn't have been able to send as many forces out to the Western Desert of Egypt. That would have meant it wouldn't have got stuck into a quagmire in Greece, which didn't last very long, but was still a fairly disastrous episode because it lost soldiers, lost all the kit. The Navy lost a load of ships. Wouldn't have done any of that, so they've been sat in Egypt holding the Germans back, waiting for reinforcements, waiting for American tanks to turn up, the Sherman, waiting for more capable generals, i.e. Montgomery, to turn up. Would there have been a huge difference? Probably not.
But so if that doesn't make that much of a difference on the North African side, okay, the Germans would have walked into Greece.
Yep.
I know it didn't, we didn't hold them up for long, but they wouldn't have been held up at all.
Well, that's interesting, yeah, because many people talk about the delay in Greece causing a delay of the attack on Russia, and a delay in the attack on Russia meaning that they didn't get to Moscow before winter set in. So it's an interesting point. I mean, you could go, it's almost infinite, and for the benefit of
listeners, it's a domino effect.
A threat. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's a counterfactual of a counterfactual. Britain didn't send reinforcements to Egypt, therefore it couldn't send reinforcements to Greece. The Germans just walked into Greece. They weren't delayed by 6 weeks in Greece. They didn't delay their attack on Russia. They'd potentially taken Moscow before winter set in. And who knows, but let's, So,
no, that's right. But then that's the point of what we talk about with what ifs.
Yeah.
Is if you can identify those dominoes, it suddenly goes off in a funny direction.
Yeah. I mean, it's as listeners can probably tell, I'm sceptical ultimately that the loss of the BF would have made any difference. The materially, I think it makes very little difference because I think the impact to the Western Desert or Egypt is mitigated by the fact of you've got less that you can do, so you don't do other things, which keeps your forces in place and means they're able to fend off the Germans. I don't think it has any impact to the potential invasion of England or Britain because the RAF and the Navy keep them back, and there's sufficient forces to deal with a landing. I don't think we can have a look at it. I don't think it has a material difference that whether America enters the war, because America enters the war for a variety of reasons. If you look at the impact of 400,
I never said they wouldn't enter the war. I was saying that Britain's position with the Americans would have been on a different footing.
They become the senior partner quicker. Fine. If you look at other countries who did lose large sums of forces, the French and the Dutch and the Belgians had soldiers being held hostage, inverted commas, in Germany to the end of the war. didn't have any impact. They were defeated, so it was different. The Russians, they lost millions, 2 or 3 million prisoners, treated dreadfully, starved to death. Obviously, it's a totalitarian regime, so there is no morale, inverted commas, aspect. The only thing really where I think you could argue is what is the impact of morale? Morale not really being what we think of as today, because there's no social media and there's no means of the ordinary people expressing their concerns to any degree in 1940, other than through the ballot box. And there wouldn't be an election as such. It would have been this layer of the governing class, whether the governing class would use it as an excuse or a valid reason to give them to say, well, we've tried to, why don't we just go for peace? We'll keep our empire, most of it. We'll come to an arrangement with Hitler. He seems like a reasonable guy, inverted commas. He said he'll keep his nose out of our business. We'll keep our nose out of his business, and that could have happened that way. No, but the counterfactual is, would you believe a word he says? 5 years later, who knows what would happen? But the bottom line is that's a completely plausible scenario. But again, how do you get to that point? Because Churchill's only been in power for 6 weeks. Why the hell would you try and get rid of him? Not his fault the BEF stuck in France.
So, I mean, our view there was that we wouldn't have tried to appease or make any settlement. Churchill was never going to do that. That was why they wanted him as Prime Minister, wasn't it? Because they needed somebody who wasn't weak in that way. And so that's that part of the story would remain unchanged.
Yeah, and even if you think... Exactly. And even if you think of the Germans, which I don't think they would, but had they literally starved British soldiers to death, well, the Japanese took 120,000 prisoners in Singapore and starved 40,000 of them to death. And the consequence of that in relation to the war in the Far East was nil. Obviously not nil if you're one of those 40,000, but they weren't all British, obviously. There was Australians and Indians and stuff and such like. But that's really, people didn't make that distinction to any large degree at the time. So, even in the most extreme version, they've got 400,000 British soldiers and they kill them all or work them to death. But, it would take years for that to happen, years for it to come out. They probably weren't going to do it, at all. So I think it's an interesting what if. And
well, I think we've got to the point where you could say that, okay, it wouldn't have made that much of a difference, apart from potentially that one little link about the reinforcements to North Africa.
Yes,
and not sending forces to Greece.
Yes,
I mean, I've never those of that, and it came up because of the conversation.
Yeah, massive ripples in the pond, because all the people that you're familiar with, well, it's all the people, those of our listeners who have read various books and watched umpteen films about the war, many of those characters survived from Dunkirk. Now, they wouldn't have appeared. So massive ripples in time, because different characters would be sat in Germany or France rather than re-entering the war in Britain and onwards. But other characters would have taken their place. The war might have gone on slightly longer. There might have been repercussions to the attack on Russia. There might have been issues in Egypt. But I think ultimately, where it would have been a tragedy for those involved and a tragedy for the people's families, because there's 10 times as many prisoners of war as, or certainly 5 or 6 times as many prisoners of war as actually been taken. I don't think it would have materially affected any major part of the war, which is interesting when you think about it.
Well, which is when we come to, do we think it, well, not necessarily a good thing or whether it was a bad thing, but more about, okay, what do we... It's fairly neutral then. It
is neutral, but it's interesting that had what I proposed happened, and it obviously had very little effect. Where does Britain sit without its Dunkirk story? It's if that never happened.
I'm slightly not as neutral, but I think that there would have been some. Things would have changed, but it's difficult.
Well,
obviously it would change. Yeah, of course they would.
Yeah.
But
the massive
I think
ripples
they would
in time.
have been.
But
yeah. I just think that there would have been more noticeable things would have been different. I don't think the outcome of the war wouldn't have changed. And the outcome of most of the major things that happened during the Second World War wouldn't have been any different.
Yeah.
Just the timing potentially, and maybe some other things may have happened. May not.
Well, I think the balancing factor is what actually happened in reality. So I think, again, listeners will keep us straight and maybe shoot us down on Twitter, but the approximately 70,000 soldiers were captured anyway in France. Obviously, tens of thousands of soldiers were captured later on in Egypt as the battles flew back and forward. Soldiers were captured in Italy. 100,000 were captured in Japan. And there wasn't maybe it was the time. There wasn't a social movement of relatives saying, I want you to stop the war so that my son/husband can come home. That didn't happen. Now, would that have happened if the number had been times 4 or times 5? I don't know. It's difficult to see how that would have.
Yeah, we'll never know. I mean, the whole point is to talk about, well, what do we think?
I think not, because I don't think people thought that way in those days. They just put up with their lot. They didn't band together. They couldn't. The technology didn't allow them to do so.
It's just one of those things where you say Britain will have its Dunkirk moment, and it's
exactly.
a big moment. So, we take out a big moment, then there's a big hole.
Yeah.
Anyway.
We'll never know, obviously, unless somebody up there's got a time machine. But the interesting thing is, it's such a big. I mean, it's not a myth because it happened, but it's such a big moment in history. And you think, well, if it didn't happen that way, I don't think it would have had a massive impact. Apart from to the 400,000 people and the tens of thousands. Sorry, the 10 times that number who knew these people, and the other people who were thrust into the front line, literally and figuratively, because other people weren't there. So there would have been huge impact across hundreds of thousands of people. But whether the thread of time would have changed much, I don't think so.
Well, it will be interesting to see what feedback we get.
Yeah.
From our myriad of listeners, hopefully.
Indeed.
Fingers crossed.
Let us know what you think.
Absolutely. Right, so I think we're done.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ian.
Yep. See you next time.
See you next time. Thanks, everybody.
That's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends.